Hello and welcome to our first video in our segment on composition. Today we're going to be talking about the basics of writing your first melody. In composition, there are many different methods of composing a melody. This particular method is called the 8-bar method or the period method, and it's fairly traditional. It's certainly not the only way to write a melody, but it is the way that we'll use for now. The benefit of using rules to compose a melody and following along is with those rules as a group is that it makes it easy to give and receive feedback and to have show you have a firm understanding of what you're doing. Now, even though it does come with lots of rules, you just need to learn to follow them first. Then we'll learn how to break them. So when we have to construct a melody, we need to set a period. Now the period is the total length for the melody and is considered sort of a musical sentence. The period is made up of 2 phrases, sometimes more, but usually only 2. And those phrases come in 2 types. You've got the antecedent, which or the question phrase. It's the sort of the first half, and the consequent or the answer phrase. So we often refer to phrases in music, perhaps erroneously, as sentences, and in certain circumstances they can be considered that. But in the sense of creating a melody, we're going to be talking about phrases as portions of sentences, the complete sentence being the period. So you can see here we have the question and the answer. Now before we write a melody, you need to know that each note serves a specific purpose. Now the purpose for that note is really dependent on what key you're writing in. So for example, we're going to be writing in C right now because it has no sharps or flats, which make our lives harder. But if you were to write, say, a C note in this phrase that we're about to make, or in this period we're going to make, it's going to serve a different function than a C would serve if we were writing in the key of F. Here are 8 different notes in the key of C, the 8 notes of the C major scale. The first note is called the tonic. This is probably one of the most important words to know. The tonic always refers to the first scale degree in a given key. The supertonic and the mediant are less important to know by the name of them. Same thing with the subdominant, although the subdominant has a little more importance. The dominant is definitely one to remember. If you have to remember 1, it's tonic. If you have to remember 2, it's tonic and dominant. The 5th scale degree has an extremely important place in any piece of written music. We then have the submediant and the leading tone, and then finally we're back to the tonic. Out of these 8, really 7, I would say focus on the tonic, the dominant, and the leading tone if you're going to be memorizing any 3 given names out of all these. I will probably interchangeably refer to these by their scale degree numbers and their scale names. Now, a melody is really just a collection of melodic intervals, one note moving into another note, which is really why we've been focusing so much lately on learning what intervals are so that we can describe how a melody functions. Now, there are 2 different ways that we can move between notes. We can move in step motion, or we can move in leaping motion. These do have official names like conjunct and disjunct motion, conjunct being step motion, but I'm not going to worry too much about the terminology when you can just as easily make yourself understood by saying step motion and leap motion. So with step motion, your sounds are connected. Your notes are very connected. It has a nice flowing feel, but it really runs the risk of being boring. Here's an example of a melody written in just step motion. We're going to listen to it here as I hop into Sibelius. And that's these bar 9, 10, 11, and 12 here. So let's give that a listen. Flip to the back here. Okay, here we go. Yeah, not really that exciting, is it? Now, if we wanted to add rhythm, we could definitely make it sound more interesting. Here are some rhythms added to what are very similar notes. Not exactly the same, but pretty close. But as you can see, it's all still step motion. And you might actually recognize this. Here we go. That melody is popularized by Charlie Brown. That dee da 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 dum bum bum ba dum bum da 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 da. So it very familiar melody that existed and has lasted quite the test of time as a popular melody, even though it's entirely in step motion. The other option we have to look at is leaping motion. Leaping motion gives us the sense of lots happening, lots of forward projection because it moves so fast. But it runs the risk of feeling really broken and kind of random. So here's another excerpt. With all of these notes exist perfectly within the key of C major. They're all perfect examples of allowable leaps. But when you put them all together, you end up with something that doesn't sound so great. So once again, pop back into Sibelius here, and let's hear what this leaping motion sounds like. So as you can see, there's no real sense of where the melody is going. Oops, I'm in the wrong screen here. There we go. There's no real sense of where the melody is going. And even though we're starting on the tonic, which is important, and we're ending on the tonic, which is also important, there's just no feeling of connectedness. But if you use the right knowledge, you can take something that is largely in leaping motion and turn it into something that sounds fairly melodic. Here's an example. So as you can see, we have something that really sounds like it's got intention to it, like it's got a direction to it, and it feels like it gets home when it gets to the end. Now, two phrases, when they come one after the other, they obviously relate to one another, and especially since they exist within the same period. Now, there are three different ways that that we can relate our phrases together. The first is through repetition. Phrases end up being almost exactly identical, but they're a little bit different. So realistically, it's almost like saying the same thing over and over again twice, but you just sort of maybe put a little different ending on it. It creates a sense of unity and completeness. Contrast is where the phrases are really, really different. This creates a tension. There feels like there's kind of a pause halfway through. There's a definite feeling of a breath being taken and a second phrase happening, but they don't feel directly related to one another. The last of the three is variation, and variation is just a combination of the two different types, a little bit of repetition and a little bit of contrast. So yeah, the two melodies are clearly related, but there's some tension, there's a good balance. One of these is not better than the other. Variation is probably the most common that you'll find, because there's always there's often a genuine desire to have a clear relation between the two melodies, or between the two chunks of melody. But really, any of these three are fine, and certainly will be in your own writing. So here's an example of some repetition. So we can see right here, so this is our first phrase in the period. Here's our second phrase, our antecedent and our consequent. C, D, E, G, G is exactly the same, even up to the B, exactly the same. We've got repetition happening at the beginning of our phrase, which is where it will feel especially obvious. And then the ending is a little bit different. Get the same rhythm for most of the phrase and the same notes for most of the phrase. Again, we're going to hop back into Sibelius here, and we'll take a look at that. So here's this period here, these 8 bars. We're going to give that a listen. So that repetition right at the beginning of each set of 4 bars really ties the melody together. Here we have a contrasting phrase. As you can see there, it almost really feels like, when you look at it, like there's no real end to the phrase. But when you listen to it, you'll hear that there's a clear antecedent and consequent phrase within the period. So once again, going back into Sibelius here, here's our second period. Okay, so not the most, I guess, balanced sounding melody. I think when I was thinking of this in my head, I heard these opening eighths as being maybe a bit of a pickup note. And now that I think about this, if I shifted this whole thing back by 1 beat, putting this as a pickup note, it would sound a lot more balanced. But doesn't matter. It was just a quick example for our needs here. So we have this clear, consistent need to go on past this point all the way to the end. There's no repetition. It just feels like one long sentence being said. So all the rhythms you can see are different. It's just the last bar of each phrase that have the same rhythm, but they're different notes, so it doesn't really feel like there's any kind of repetition happening. The last option we have here is variation. You can see here that rhythmically, each of these measures is perfectly identical. So we have some repetition happening in our rhythms. But melodically, I shouldn't say melodically, the notes are very clearly different. So let's go back into Sibelius and give that a listen. Awesome. So there's a consistency between the two phrases. We definitely feel like they are related to each other, but realistically, they have very different pitches, making a clear antecedent and consequent. There are other ways to mix repetition and contrast. This is just one example. We might use different rhythms but similar notes. We might use chunks with the same rhythms and the same notes and then going some other direction. There's lots of ways to add variation within by mixing repetition and contrast, and that's going to be kind of up to you to a certain extent how that works. So let's do a quick review. There is a lot of information there. This is all this background stuff you need to know. So the length of a melody is called a period. We are working within an 8-bar period. The period is typically divided into 2 phrases, the antecedent and the consequent, or the question and answer. Scale degrees each have a name, scale degrees being what number of the note it is in the scale, but some are more important to remember than others. The tonic being the first note dominant and the leading tone being the 3 that you need to remember the most, at least for now. Each phrase is a collection of notes that relate to one another, and how they relate to one another is through motion. Repetition, contrast, and variation is how the 2 phrases relate to one another, and then the melody is simply a collection of intervals. We move between notes in 2 different ways through both step motion and leaping motion. So that's a lot of information to digest in this. We don't have quite enough knowledge to start writing our own music yet, but keep this information tucked away to reference at any time you might need. Our next video, we will actually begin the composition process. So, as always, if you have questions, feel free to drop me a line. If you have comments on the video, things that you might like clarified in case I teach this again, I would be very happy to take that information and make some updates to my presentation. Thanks very much, guys. We will talk to you again soon.